On the morning of August 15, 1944, the sun rose over the hedgerows of Normandy, with a golden haze that seemed almost peaceful, belying the chaos that had gripped this corner of France for more than 2 months. The air hung thick with humidity, carrying the scent of crushed apples from nearby orchards and something else, something metallic and ancient that soldiers learned never to name aloud. In a shallow depression behind a crumbling stone wall, approximately 300 meters from a fortified farmhouse that commanded the only road into the village of Saint-Colombe, 23-year-old Corporal Evelyn Washington pressed her eye to the scope of her Springfield rifle and steadied her breathing. She had been in this position for 6 hours. Her muscles ached, her throat burned with thirst. But none of that mattered, because through that scope, she could see the barrel of the machine gun that had claimed the lives of 47 American soldiers in the past 72 hours alone. The German position was masterfully constructed, a stone farmhouse with walls nearly a meter thick, firing slits cut at precise angles, and overlapping fields of fire that turned the road below into what the men called the corridor of no return. 4 previous attempts to neutralize it had failed. 2 infantry assaults, an artillery barrage that somehow missed the structure entirely, a tank that was disabled before it could get within effective range. What the American commanders did not yet understand, what Evelyn Washington was only beginning to piece together through her patient observation, was that this was no ordinary defensive position. The soldier operating that machine gun was not merely competent, he was exceptional, and he had help. What appeared to be a single gun emplacement was actually a coordinated system of 3 positions, with spotters and communication lines that allowed the defenders to anticipate and counter every American move before it fully developed. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the story of how a young woman from Chicago, fighting in a conflict that did not want her, saw what no one else could see, and how a single perfectly placed shot would not only end the deadliest obstacle in the American advance through Normandy, but would challenge everything the military establishment believed about who could serve, how wars were won, and what it truly meant to be a soldier. It is a story of patience, prejudice, and precision, and it begins not in France, but in a cramped apartment on the south side of Chicago, where a girl taught herself to shoot by aiming at rats in the alley behind her building. Evelyn May Washington was born on March 3, 1921, in a 2-room apartment above a grocery store on 43rd Street. Her father, Samuel Washington, had served in the First World War as part of the 369th Infantry Regiment, the Harlem Hellfighters, and had returned home with a Bronze Star, a limp from a shrapnel wound that never fully healed, and a profound bitterness about a country that had sent him to fight for freedoms it would not grant him. Her mother, Della, worked as a seamstress, her fingers never still. Always mending, always creating, always finding ways to stretch a dollar until it screamed. The family lived in the heart of the Black Belt, that narrow strip of Chicago where restrictive covenants and racial violence confined nearly 300,000 African Americans to an area designed for perhaps a third that number. The apartment was cold in winter, stifling in summer, and always too small. But Della Washington kept it immaculate. She believed in dignity as a form of resistance, in pressed clothes and polished shoes and perfect grammar as armor against a world that wanted to see her family as less than human. Samuel Washington rarely spoke about the conflict that had taken his mobility and in many ways his spirit. But he kept his service rifle, a 1917 Enfield, wrapped in oilcloth in the back of the bedroom closet. When Evelyn was 12, she found it while searching for her mother's hidden Christmas presents. She did not touch it that first time, but she came back to look at it again and again, fascinated by its weight, its precision, the way it represented a chapter of her father's life he would not discuss. The rats came in the winter of 1933, the worst year of the Depression, when families in the building could not afford to dispose of garbage properly, and the creatures multiplied in the walls and alleys. They were bold, those rats, big as cats, some of them, and utterly unafraid of humans. They ate through food supplies that families could not afford to replace. They bit children in their sleep, Old Mrs. Patterson on the third floor contracted an infection from a bite and lost her hand. Evelyn's father, by then working inconsistent hours at a meat-packing plant when his leg allowed, was too exhausted and too broken to address the problem. So Evelyn took matters into her own hands. She retrieved the Enfield from the closet, found the box of ammunition hidden behind it, and taught herself to shoot. She could not fire the weapon, of course. The noise would have brought police, complaints, chaos. So she practiced everything else. She learned to load and unload by feel, alone, in total darkness. She practiced her breathing, her stance, her trigger discipline. She read everything she could find about marksmanship at the public library. Military manuals, hunting guides, anything with information about ballistics and windage, and the geometry of sending a small piece of metal exactly where you wanted it to go. And then she turned to other weapons, quieter ones. A slingshot first, then a pellet gun purchased with 6 months of saved pennies. She practiced in the alley behind the building in the grey hours before dawn, when she could see well enough to aim, but the neighborhood was still asleep. The rats became her targets. They were quick, unpredictable, and required precision. They did not give second chances. By the time she was 14, Evelyn Washington was the most accurate shooter on the south side of Chicago, though nobody knew it except the rats and her own quiet satisfaction. By the time she was 16, she could put a pellet through a bottle cap at 30 meters, and she had rid her building so thoroughly of vermin that neighbors started asking her father what his secret was. Samuel Washington discovered what his daughter had been doing on an April morning in 1937. He woke early with his leg aching and walked to the kitchen for water, and through the window he saw Evelyn in the alley below, utterly still, utterly focused, the pellet gun raised and ready. He watched her wait. He watched her breathe, and he watched her take the shot. A single rat mid-stride dropped instantly. He never mentioned what he saw. But that evening, he took the Enfield from the closet, sat down at the kitchen table, and began to teach his daughter everything he knew about shooting. The principles of trajectory, the mathematics of distance, how to read wind by watching grass and leaves and the flight of birds, how to wait, sometimes for hours, for the right moment, the only moment, and most importantly, how to remain calm when everything depended on a single irreversible action. Father and daughter would sit at that kitchen table 2 or 3 evenings a week for the next 2 years, the rifle between them, speaking a language of angles and adjustments that Della Washington did not understand, but recognized as something precious, a bridge between her husband's broken past and her daughter's uncertain future. Samuel never explained why he was teaching her these things. Perhaps he sensed even then that another conflict was coming. Perhaps he simply needed to pass on the one thing the country had given him that still felt wholly his own. Perhaps he saw in his daughter's patience and precision a gift that deserved to be cultivated. When the conflict in Europe began in September of 1939, Evelyn was 18 years old and working as a secretary at a black-owned insurance company on South Parkway. She followed the news carefully, tracing the German advances on maps she bought at the 5 and dime, imagining the distances, the terrain, the challenges of sending accurate fire across the hedgerows and forests she read about in newspaper accounts. When the United States entered the conflict in December of 1941, she knew immediately that she would find a way to serve. The obstacles were, of course, immense. The American military was rigidly segregated, with black soldiers confined to support roles and labor battalions, denied the opportunity to serve in combat positions where they might prove themselves equal to white soldiers. The Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, established in May of 1942, accepted black women, but only in limited numbers, in segregated units and exclusively in administrative and support positions. The idea of a black woman serving as a combat soldier, let alone a sniper, was so far outside the realm of possibility that it did not even register as something to be formally prohibited. It was simply unthinkable. Evelyn Washington thought it anyway. She enlisted in the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps in August of 1942, 2 weeks after the first class of black women was accepted. She was assigned to a segregated unit at Fort Des Moines, Iowa, where she trained as a typist and file clerk. She excelled at the work. She'd always been organized and precise, but she made sure to also excel at everything physical. She was the fastest runner in her unit. She scored highest on every fitness assessment. When a training sergeant organized informal marksmanship practice for interested personnel, she attended every session, careful to perform well, but not so well as to draw excessive attention. She was drawing attention anyway. Her unit commander, Captain Lorraine Fletcher, was a 42-year-old former schoolteacher from Alabama who had joined the Corps with modest expectations and found herself constantly surprised by the quality of the women under her command. She noticed Evelyn Washington immediately, noticed her discipline, her intelligence, and the way other women in the unit naturally looked to her for guidance. During a routine inspection in October of 1942, she asked Washington what she hoped to do in the military. Evelyn considered lying, considered saying something safe about wanting to serve her country in whatever capacity was needed, about being grateful for the opportunity, about not expecting anything beyond what was offered. But something in Captain Fletcher's eyes, a directness, a genuine curiosity, made her tell the truth. She wanted to be a sniper, she said. She wanted to use the skills she had spent years developing to directly impact the outcome of the conflict. She wanted to prove that a black woman could serve in combat as effectively as anyone else. Captain Fletcher was quiet for a long moment. Then she said that what Evelyn wanted was impossible. The military would never allow it. Society would never accept it. The very idea would be seen as absurd, offensive, dangerous to the established order. Evelyn said she understood. Then she asked if Captain Fletcher could teach her to type faster. The captain laughed, a short, surprised sound, and said she could, but she also said something else, something that would change the trajectory of Evelyn Washington's service. She said she had a cousin in the Office of Strategic Services, the intelligence agency that operated behind enemy lines. She said the OSS was less rigid than the regular military, more willing to use unconventional personnel for unconventional missions. She said she could not promise anything, but she could write a letter. Evelyn Washington spent the next 14 months typing, filing, and waiting. She continued her private marksmanship practice whenever possible, maintaining her skills with whatever weapons she could access. She studied maps of Europe, learned basic French from a borrowed grammar book, and read everything she could find about German military tactics and equipment. And she waited. The letter that changed her life arrived in December of 1943. It was brief, official, and revealed almost nothing, only that she was to report to a training facility in Virginia for assessment regarding specialized duties. She was given no details about what those duties might be or why she had been selected. She was simply told to report. The facility was a converted country estate in the Virginia countryside, surrounded by woods and security fences and an atmosphere of deliberate mystery. Evelyn arrived to find herself among perhaps 30 other candidates, all women, about a third of them black, all selected through similarly opaque processes. They were told they were being evaluated for potential service with the OSS in roles that would be explained only to those who passed the assessment. The evaluation would last 3 weeks. It would be difficult. Most of them would not be selected. The first week focused on physical conditioning and basic military skills, the kind of training Evelyn had already mastered at Fort Des Moines. She performed well, but not exceptionally, still wary of standing out too much. The second week introduced more specialized content: map reading, surveillance techniques, basic intelligence gathering, the fundamentals of operating behind enemy lines. Evelyn excelled at all of it, her natural precision and patience serving her well in exercises that required observation and analysis. The third week brought weapons training, and Evelyn finally allowed herself to show what she could do. The instructor was a Marine Corps gunnery sergeant named Harold Rourke, a veteran of the Pacific Campaign with a missing finger and a permanent squint from too many years of staring through rifle scopes. He taught the candidates to shoot the way he had been taught, through repetition, discipline, and endless correction. He was methodical, demanding, and completely uninterested in his students' backgrounds or personal stories. He cared only about results. On the first day of rifle training, he had each candidate fire 5 rounds at a target 50 meters away. Most of the women managed to hit the target. A few hit the center rings. Evelyn Washington put all 5 rounds through the same hole. Sergeant Rourke walked down to the target, examined it, walked back and told her to do it again. She did. Same result. He had her shoot at 75 meters, then 100, then 150. Her groups opened slightly at distance, as they had to, but her accuracy remained exceptional. When he finally asked where she had learned to shoot, she told him the truth. Her father, the rats, the years of private practice. He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked if she had ever shot at a living target larger than a rat. She said no. He asked if she thought she could. She said yes. Sergeant Rourke told her to report to his office after dinner. When she arrived, she found him with two other people, a woman in civilian clothes who introduced herself only as Mrs. Davies, and a man in an army colonel's uniform who did not introduce himself at all. They asked her questions for 2 hours, about her family, her education, her motivations, about her political beliefs, her experiences with racism, her feelings about the military that had confined her to a typing pool, about her willingness to work alone, to endure hardship, to take lives in service of her mission. She answered honestly. She talked about her father and the pride he took in his service, despite everything the country had done to him. She talked about wanting to prove that black women were capable of more than the roles they were assigned. She talked about seeing the conflict as an opportunity, perhaps the only opportunity she would ever have, to demonstrate her abilities on a stage where they could not be ignored or dismissed. The colonel asked if she understood that if she was captured, she would be treated as a spy and likely executed. She said she understood. Mrs. Davies asked if she understood that even if she succeeded, she might never receive recognition for her service, that the military might bury her record to avoid acknowledging what it had allowed. She said she understood that too. They told her to return to her barracks and wait. 3 days later, she was informed that she had been selected for advanced training as an OSS operative, specializing in precision marksmanship. The next 6 months were the most challenging and exhilarating of Evelyn Washington's life. She trained at a series of facilities across the eastern United States, never staying in one place for more than a few weeks, learning skills that ranged from the technical to the seemingly impossible. Long-range shooting with the Springfield 1903 rifle that would become her primary weapon. Silent movement through forests, fields, and urban environments. Hand-to-hand combat. Demolitions, radio operation, survival techniques, resistance to interrogation, parachute jumping, the French language, in which she became reasonably fluent, and above all, the art of patience of waiting for hours or days in uncomfortable positions, in bad weather, under constant threat, for a single opportunity that might last only a fraction of a second. Her primary instructor during this period was a British commando named Major Colin Whitfield, who had spent 2 years operating behind German lines in France and had personally trained more than a dozen snipers who were now deployed throughout the European theatre. He was a small, quiet man with a scholar's vocabulary and a killer's eyes, and he pushed Evelyn harder than she had ever been pushed in her life. The first time she missed a target during training, a silhouette at 400 meters in a crosswind, he made her run 5 miles, then set up and take the shot again. When she missed again, he made her run 5 more miles. By the end of the day, she had run nearly 30 miles and taken the shot 11 times. She finally made it on the 12th attempt, her muscles screaming, her vision blurred with exhaustion, operating on nothing but will and the refusal to fail. That, Major Whitfield told her, was the point. The shot you take exhausted, uncomfortable, and afraid is the shot that matters. Anyone can hit a target on a calm day with a full night's sleep. Snipers hit targets when everything is working against them. He also taught her the psychological dimensions of her work, the weight of taking a life deliberately, from a distance, with time to think about what she was doing. He told her that some snipers were destroyed by this weight, that they saw faces in their dreams, that they could not reconcile the intimacy of looking at a person through a scope with the finality of what they did next. Others, he said, felt nothing, and that was perhaps worse, a kind of death inside that made them something less than human. The goal, he told her, was to feel the weight but carry it anyway, to understand that what she did was necessary, that it served a purpose larger than herself, and that the alternative, allowing those she targeted to continue their work, was worse than the act of stopping them. This was not easy. It should not be easy. But it was possible. Evelyn listened carefully. And she thought about what he said during the long nights in her barracks bunk. She thought about her father, and how he had carried his own weight for more than 2 decades, the things he had seen and done, the recognition he had been denied, the knowledge that his country viewed his service as an embarrassment rather than an honor. She thought about the faces of the men she would target through her scope, men with families perhaps, with hopes and fears and reasons for what they did. She thought about whether she could do what was being asked of her, and she decided that she could, because the alternative was to accept that her life would be defined by limitations others placed on her. Because somewhere in France, American soldiers were being cut down by German machine guns, and she had the ability to stop it, because her father had served, and now it was her turn. In May of 1944, Evelyn Washington was deployed to England as part of a team of OSS operatives preparing for the invasion of France. She was given the rank of corporal, assigned to a unit that existed only on paper, and told that she would be inserted into France shortly after the initial landings to conduct targeted operations against high-value German positions. Her specific assignments would be determined based on battlefield conditions and the needs of advancing American forces. The team she joined consisted of 4 other operatives, 3 men and 1 woman, each with their own specialization. Thomas Green was a demolitions expert from Ohio who had been a mining engineer before the conflict. Margaret Chen was a radio operator from San Francisco whose parents had emigrated from China and who spoke 4 languages fluently. William Kowalski was a former Chicago police officer who specialized in close-quarters combat and urban operations. And James Whitmore was a reconnaissance specialist from Virginia who had an almost supernatural ability to move through any terrain without being detected. They were a strange group, brought together not by shared background or natural affinity, but by complementary skills and a willingness to operate outside normal military structures. They trained together for 3 weeks in the English countryside, learning to function as a unit, to anticipate each other's movements, to communicate through gestures and glances when silence was essential. Evelyn was the only sniper, the only black person, and one of only 2 women. She waited for resentment, for challenges to her presence, for the resistance she had encountered throughout her life. It did not come. These were people who had been selected precisely because they could see past conventional categories, who judged others solely by capability. Thomas Green cared only whether Evelyn could make her shots. When he saw that she could, he treated her as a valued colleague. Margaret Chen had faced her own discrimination as a Chinese American and recognized a kindred spirit. William Kowalski had worked with black officers in the Chicago police, who had impressed him more than most of his white colleagues. James Whitmore was simply indifferent to everything except competence and mission success. They did not become friends exactly. The work was too intense, the stakes too high, the future too uncertain for the normal processes of friendship. But they became something perhaps more valuable, a team that trusted each other completely, that would risk their lives for each other without hesitation, that functioned as a single organism with 5 bodies and 1 purpose. Evelyn was inserted into France on June 10, 1944, 4 days after the initial landings. She parachuted into a field outside Carentan with Thomas Green, while the other 3 members of her team landed several kilometers away. The plan was to link up within 24 hours, but German patrols were heavier than expected, and it took them 3 days to finally reunite at a farmhouse run by a French family who supported the resistance. The family was named Fournier, a father, mother, and 3 children who ranged in age from 8 to 16. They had been sheltering escaped prisoners and downed pilots for more than 2 years, at constant risk of discovery and execution. When Evelyn entered their kitchen and removed her helmet, revealing her face for the first time, the youngest child, a girl named Sylvie, stared at her with undisguised wonder. She had never seen a black person before. She asked her mother, in rapid French that Evelyn could mostly follow, if the American lady was made of chocolate. The mother, Madame Fournier, hushed her daughter and apologized to Evelyn. Evelyn laughed, the first time she had laughed in days, and told the girl that she was not made of chocolate but that she wished she were, because then she would never be hungry. Sylvie considered this seriously and then offered Evelyn a piece of bread from her own small ration. It was one of the most generous gifts Evelyn would receive during the entire conflict. The team spent 2 weeks operating from the Fournier farmhouse and other safe locations, conducting reconnaissance and small-scale sabotage as American forces slowly pushed inland from the beaches. Evelyn did not fire her rifle during this period. The missions did not call for her particular skills, but she was learning the terrain, the German positions, the patterns of movement and reinforcement that would inform her work when the time came. That time came on August 12th, when the team received orders to investigate a German position that was blocking the American advance towards St. Lo. The position was described in the briefing as a reinforced machine gun nest that had repelled multiple assaults and was believed to be responsible for significant American casualties. The team was to reconnoiter the position, identify its vulnerabilities, and recommend a course of action for neutralizing it. James Whitmore conducted the initial reconnaissance, spending nearly 18 hours in a concealed position, observing the German emplacement. What he reported was troubling. The position was not a single machine gun nest, but a coordinated system of at least 3 firing positions built into a stone farmhouse and its outbuildings. The positions had overlapping fields of fire that covered every approach. They were connected by communication trenches that allowed the defenders to shift rapidly in response to threats. And they were manned by soldiers who displayed unusual discipline and coordination, who seemed to anticipate American movements before they fully developed. The center of this system, its brain, was a single machine gun position on the 2nd floor of the farmhouse. This was where the primary gunner operated, and based on the accuracy and timing of his fire, he was exceptional. Whitmore estimated that this one gunner was responsible for most of the American casualties, and that as long as he was operational, any conventional assault on the position would fail. Captain Morrison, the OSS officer overseeing their operations, asked the team for recommendations. Thomas Green suggested demolitions, a nighttime approach to plant charges at the base of the farmhouse. But the communication trenches made such an approach extremely risky. The team would likely be detected before they reached the building. William Kowalski suggested a diversionary assault to draw the defenders' attention, while a smaller element infiltrated from another direction. But the overlapping fields of fire made this problematic. There was no angle of approach that was not covered by at least one of the positions. Evelyn studied Whitmore's sketches of the position, the farmhouse, the outbuildings, the trenches, the sight lines, and she saw something the others had not. There was a gap, a small one, perhaps 30 meters wide, in the northeast corner of the German defensive perimeter. One of the outbuildings partially blocked the view from the main farmhouse, creating a narrow corridor that was not covered by the primary machine gun position. The secondary positions could cover it, but only if they knew to look there. If she could get into that corridor undetected, she would have a shot. Not an easy shot. The range would be nearly 300 meters. The angle would be difficult, and she would be able to see only a small portion of the 2nd floor window where the primary gunner operated. She would have to wait for him to move into her field of view, and then take the shot instantly, with no time to adjust, no opportunity for a second attempt. If she missed, her muzzle flash would reveal her position, and the secondary guns would cut her down within seconds. She explained her analysis to the team. Thomas Green asked what the odds were that she could make the shot. She said she did not know. It depended on factors she could not predict: the light, the wind, the exact position of the target at the moment of firing. But she believed she could do it, and she believed it was the best option available. Captain Morrison was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked the question that Evelyn had been waiting for, the question that would determine whether she would be allowed to do what she had trained her entire life to do. He asked if she was sure she wanted to take this risk. He noted that she was valuable, that her skills would be needed for future operations, that sacrificing herself for a single position, however troublesome, might not be the wisest use of resources. He did not mention her race or gender. He did not need to. The implication was clear. Was she sure she wanted to risk her life for a country that did not fully accept her? Evelyn said she was sure. She said that the soldiers being cut down by that machine gun were American soldiers, her countrymen, and that their lives mattered regardless of how the country treated her. She said that she had spent years developing her skills, and that this was exactly the situation those skills were designed for. She said that if she did not take this shot, she would have to live with the knowledge that she had declined to act when she had the ability to save lives. Captain Morrison nodded slowly. He said the operation was approved. They would insert the following night. The next 24 hours were the longest of Evelyn Washington's life. She prepared her equipment with obsessive care, cleaning her rifle, checking her ammunition, rehearsing her movements in her mind. She studied Whitmore's sketches until she could see the position with her eyes closed. She calculated angles and distances and wind effects, and she thought about what she was about to do, not the shot itself, which she had practiced thousands of times, but the finality of it, the life she would end. Major Whitfield had prepared her for this moment. He had told her to feel the weight but carry it anyway. She felt it now. She felt the heaviness of what she was about to do, the knowledge that a man she had never met would die because of her action, that his family would grieve, that his story would end. She did not try to push this feeling away. She held it, examined it, accepted it, and then she set it aside and focused on her mission. The team inserted at 0300 hours on August 15th. Margaret Chen remained at the farmhouse to monitor radio communications. The other four moved through the darkness toward the German position, following a route that Whitmore had scouted and memorized. They traveled in single file, 5 meters apart, communicating only through hand signals, stopping every few minutes to listen for patrols. The night was warm and humid, the air thick with the smell of vegetation and distant smoke. They reached the approach point at 0430 with perhaps 90 minutes until dawn. Whitmore led Evelyn to the edge of the corridor she had identified, the gap in the German defenses that would give her the shot. From here, she would proceed alone. The others would take up positions to provide covering fire if she was detected and to support her withdrawal after the shot. Thomas Green squeezed her shoulder once, a gesture of solidarity and good luck, and then they were gone, melting into the darkness. Evelyn began her approach. The corridor was approximately 150 meters long, running along the base of a gentle slope, covered with tall grass and scattered brush. At the end of it, she would set up in a small depression behind a stone wall, the position from which she would take her shot. She moved slowly, staying low, pausing every few meters to scan for threats. The grass was wet with dew, soaking her uniform. A slight breeze came from the southwest, perhaps 5 to 7 kilometers per hour, which she would need to account for in her aim. She reached the depression at 0515, with approximately 45 minutes until sunrise. She settled into her position, arranged her equipment, and began her observation. Through her scope, she could see the second-floor window of the farmhouse, a dark rectangle approximately 2 meters wide and 1 meter tall. The machine gun was positioned in the right side of the window, its barrel just visible. But the gunner was not at his weapon. She would have to wait. Waiting was what she had trained for. Waiting was what she did better than almost anything else. She controlled her breathing, slowing it to a rhythm that would keep her steady when the moment came. She monitored the wind, the light, the small movements in her field of vision that told her the position was still manned. And she thought about her father, sitting at the kitchen table all those years ago, teaching her the patience that would make this moment possible. The sun rose at 0602. The light changed from grey to gold, illuminating the farmhouse and the fields around it. Evelyn could now see the interior of the second-floor room more clearly, the machine gun, the sandbags around it, the dark space behind it where the gunner would sit. Still no movement. She continued to wait. At 0647 she saw him, a figure moving in the shadows at the back of the room, stepping forward toward the machine gun. She could not see him clearly yet, just a shape, a suggestion of movement. She placed her finger on the trigger, took up the slack, and waited for him to step into the light. He did, and Evelyn Washington froze. The gunner was young. That was her first thought. He could not have been more than 18 or 19. With a thin face and dark hair that fell across his forehead, he looked tired. He looked scared. He looked like a boy who had been placed behind a terrible machine and told to do terrible things, and who had done them because he did not know what else to do. For a fraction of a second, Evelyn hesitated. She saw not a target, but a person, someone's son, someone's brother, someone with a life and a future that she was about to end. She felt the weight that Major Whitfield had warned her about. and for that moment, it was too heavy to bear. And then, she thought about the 47 American soldiers who had died because of this boy's aim. She thought about their families, their futures, their lives that had ended in that corridor of no return. She thought about the soldiers who would die today if she did not act, who were probably already moving into position for another assault, trusting that the obstacle would be removed. She thought about her father and the weight he had carried for 25 years, and she understood that this was what it meant to serve. Not glory, not recognition, not the clean satisfaction of simple choices. This, the terrible necessity of doing what had to be done, feeling the full weight of it and carrying on anyway. She exhaled slowly. She steadied her aim. And in the space between one heartbeat and the next, she fired. The Springfield made a single sharp crack that echoed across the fields. Through her scope, Evelyn saw the young gunner jerk backward and fall. She did not see him hit the ground. She was already moving, breaking down her position, preparing to withdraw. She had rehearsed this a dozen times in her mind, the exact sequence of actions, the precise route she would take, the timing that would get her out of the corridor before the German response. But there was no response. The secondary positions, which should have opened fire the moment they heard the shot, remained silent. The farmhouse, which should have erupted with activity as the defenders scrambled to locate the threat, was still. For a long moment, nothing happened at all. Then Thomas Green's voice came over her earpiece. "Target down! No movement from secondary positions. I think they're confused. They don't know what happened." Evelyn realized what had occurred. Her shot had been so precise, so unexpected, that the other defenders did not understand what they were seeing. Their commander, their exceptional gunner, had simply fallen. There had been no assault, no artillery, no obvious threat, just a man collapsing at his weapon with no apparent cause. They did not know they were under attack. They did not know where to shoot. This confusion lasted perhaps 30 seconds, but 30 seconds was enough. Whitmore's voice came over the earpiece. "Secondary gunners withdrawing to the farmhouse. They're abandoning the outbuildings." This was the opportunity. With the secondary positions unmanned, American forces could advance through corridors that had been covered before. If they moved quickly, they could overrun the farmhouse before the defenders reorganized. Evelyn did not know if the American forces were ready to advance. That was beyond her scope of information. But Thomas Green was already on the radio to Captain Morrison, reporting the situation, requesting immediate support. Within minutes, the message was relayed up the chain of command, and a company of infantry that had been waiting for the order was moving toward the position. The assault on the farmhouse took less than 20 minutes. The defenders, disorganized and demoralized by the loss of their leader, offered only scattered resistance. By 07:30, the position was in American hands. The road to Saint-Colombe was open. Evelyn Washington did not participate in the assault. Her mission was complete, and her orders were to withdraw to the team's rally point and await extraction. She moved through the corridor she had traversed earlier, her mind strangely empty, her body operating on the automatic discipline of her training. She did not think about what she had done. She did not think about anything at all. She reached the rally point at 0800 and found her team waiting for her. Thomas Green embraced her, a quick, fierce hug that surprised them both. William Kowalski nodded once, his version of high praise. James Whitmore simply said, "Good shot." Margaret Chen was monitoring radio traffic and reported that American forces had secured the farmhouse with minimal casualties. The position that had claimed 47 American lives in 3 days had been neutralized with no additional losses. The company commander was calling it a miracle. It was not a miracle. It was a single bullet, placed precisely at exactly the right moment, by a woman who had spent her entire life preparing for that moment. But Evelyn did not say this. She did not say anything. She sat down against a tree, closed her eyes, and allowed herself to feel, for the first time, the magnitude of what she had done. The weight was there, just as Major Whitfield had promised. She had taken a life. She had looked through her scope at a young man's face and decided that he would die. She would carry that weight for the rest of her life, would see that face in quiet moments, would wonder about who he had been and what he might have become. This was the cost of what she had done, and she would pay it. But she had also saved lives. The soldiers who would have died in the next assault, and the next, and the next, they would go home to their families because of what she had done. The 47 who had already fallen were beyond her help. But she had stopped the count there, had prevented the number from growing. This was not redemption, it did not balance the scales or erase the weight, but it was something. It was the reason she had pulled the trigger. The team was extracted that evening and returned to their base in England for debriefing. Captain Morrison commended Evelyn's performance and recommended her for decoration, a recommendation that would, as Mrs. Davies had warned, disappear into the bureaucracy without result. The official record of the action at Saint-Colombe would credit the assault to the infantry company that had taken the farmhouse. Evelyn Washington's name would appear nowhere. She was not surprised. She had known from the beginning that her service might never be acknowledged, that she was operating outside the boundaries of what the military was willing to admit. She had accepted this condition when she took the assignment, and she found, now that the moment had come, that it mattered less than she had expected. She knew what she had done. Her team knew. That would have to be enough. But the story did not end there, because while the official military bureaucracy was content to bury Evelyn Washington's contribution, the soldiers who had been there, who had seen the fortified farmhouse and watched their friends die trying to take it, wanted to know what had happened. How had the position fallen so quickly? Why had the legendary gunner suddenly dropped at his weapon? Who had taken the shot that opened the road to Saint-Colombe? Rumors spread through the ranks, as rumors do. A sniper, some said, an OSS operative, a woman, according to others, one of those secret agents who did things the regular military could not. And a black woman, whispered a few, who had heard something from someone who had seen something. A black woman sniper. Could that be true? Could the military actually have allowed such a thing? The soldiers did not know whether to believe these rumors. They seemed too strange, too far outside the bounds of how the world was supposed to work. But they repeated them anyway, because the alternative, that their friends had simply been lucky, that the German gunner had suffered a heart attack or a sudden failure of nerve, was less satisfying. They wanted there to be a story. They wanted there to be a hero. One of these soldiers was Sergeant First Class Robert Holden, a 34-year-old from Georgia, who had lost his best friend in the third assault on the Saint-Colombe position. Holden was not a man who questioned the racial order of the military or society. He had grown up in the segregated South and accepted its categories as natural and proper. But he had also learned, over 18 months of combat, that courage and competence did not follow the color lines he had been taught to expect. He had seen black soldiers in labor battalions perform under fire with more discipline than white infantrymen. He had seen his assumptions challenged again and again by the realities of conflict. So when he heard the rumor about a black woman sniper, he did not dismiss it out of hand. He filed it away in his mind and waited. And in September of 1944, when his company was rotated back to England for rest and refit, he started asking questions. It took him 2 weeks to find someone who would talk. An OSS officer, 3 drinks into an evening at a London pub, confirmed that the rumors were true, that a Negro woman named Washington had indeed taken the shot at Saint-Colombe, that she was one of the best marksmen the agency had ever trained, and that she was still operating in France. The officer would not say more, but he did not need to. Holden had what he wanted. He wrote a letter to his hometown newspaper, the Macon Telegraph, describing what he had learned. He wrote that a colored woman had saved his life and the lives of dozens of other American soldiers. He wrote that she deserved recognition for her service, regardless of her race or sex. He wrote that if the military would not honor her, then the American people should know what she had done. The letter was not published. The editor of the Macon Telegraph had no interest in printing stories about Negro heroism, and even less interest in stories that challenged the military's racial policies. He threw the letter away and did not respond. But Holden had sent copies to other papers as well, papers in New York, Chicago, and Washington that he hoped might be more receptive. The New York paper ignored him. The Washington paper ignored him. But the Chicago Defender, the most influential black newspaper in the country, did not ignore him. The Defender had been campaigning for the integration of the military since before the conflict began. Its editors understood that Black Americans needed heroes, needed visible proof that they were contributing to the war effort in ways that could not be dismissed or diminished. When they received Holden's letter in October of 1944, they recognized its significance immediately. Here was a white soldier from Georgia, testifying to the heroism of a black woman. Here was evidence that could not be attributed to racial bias or exaggeration. Here was the story they had been looking for. The Defender published Holden's letter on October 28, 1944, under the headline, "Georgia Sergeant Credits Negro Woman Sniper with Saving His Life." The story was picked up by other black papers across the country. Within a week, Evelyn Washington was famous, at least within the black community. Her name was spoken in churches and barbershops, in living rooms and factory break rooms. People who had never heard of the OSS, who did not know that the military used snipers, who had never imagined that a black woman could serve in such a role. All of them now knew Evelyn Washington's name. The military was not pleased. OSS operations were classified, and the revelation of Washington's identity and role violated security protocols. More importantly, her sudden fame threatened to force the military to acknowledge her service, to give her decorations, promotions, and recognition that would set precedents the brass did not want to set. If they honored Washington, how could they continue to deny combat roles to other black soldiers? How could they maintain that black people were not suited for certain types of service? Captain Morrison was ordered to find the source of the leak and ensure that no further information was released. Evelyn was pulled from active operations and assigned to administrative duties at the OSS facility in London. She was not disciplined. Her performance had been too exemplary for that, but she was effectively benched, removed from the work she had trained to do. She accepted this with the same composure she had brought to every other obstacle in her career. She had known from the beginning that her service would be tolerated only as long as it was invisible. She had known that if she became too prominent, too threatening to the established order, she would be contained. This was the price of being who she was in the institution she had chosen. She would pay it because she had no other choice. But she was not without allies. Colonel William Donovan, the founder and director of the OSS, had been following Washington's career since her selection for the program. Donovan was not a racial progressive. He was a product of his time and class, with all the blind spots that implied. But he was also a pragmatist who valued results above all else, and Washington's results were undeniable. She had neutralized one of the most troublesome German positions in Normandy with a single shot. She was exactly the kind of operative the OSS needed. Donovan pushed back against the pressure to sideline Washington. He argued that she was too valuable to waste on administrative work, that her skills were needed in the field, and that the publicity, while unfortunate, could actually benefit the agency by demonstrating its willingness to use unconventional personnel. He did not win the argument entirely, but he won enough of it to get Washington back into training for future operations. She returned to active duty in December of 1944, just as the German counteroffensive in the Ardennes, what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, was beginning. The OSS needed every capable operative it had, and questions about Washington's race and visibility became secondary to the immediate crisis. Evelyn was inserted into Belgium on December 23rd with a mission to identify and neutralize German command and control positions that were coordinating the offensive. The conditions were brutal: deep snow, bitter cold, limited supplies, and German forces that were advancing faster than anyone had anticipated. She spent the next 3 weeks operating alone in the forests of the Ardennes, moving from position to position, taking shots when opportunities presented themselves, gathering intelligence when they did not. She would later say that those weeks were the hardest of her service, not because of the physical conditions, though they were severe, not because of the danger, though it was constant, but because of the isolation, the long days and nights with no one to talk to, no one to confirm that she was still human, still connected to the world she was fighting to protect. She talked to herself sometimes just to hear a voice. She recited poetry she had memorized as a child. She composed letters to her parents that she would never send, telling them what she was doing and why, trying to make them understand. She made 7 confirmed hits during the Ardennes campaign, 7 German officers and senior NCOs whose removal disrupted enemy operations and saved American lives. She was never detected. She was never engaged. She moved through the forests like a ghost, appearing, striking, and vanishing before anyone knew she was there. When she was finally extracted in mid-January of 1945, she had lost 18 pounds and had frostbite on 3 toes that would trouble her for the rest of her life. Captain Morrison told her that her performance had been extraordinary, that she had contributed more to the American defensive effort than many entire units. He told her that she would receive a Bronze Star for her service, a decoration that would be awarded secretly, recorded in a classified file, and never publicly acknowledged. Evelyn thanked him. Then she asked when she could return to the field. She was deployed twice more before the conflict in Europe ended, once into Germany itself in March of 1945, and once into Austria in late April. These operations were shorter and less intense than the Ardennes campaign. By then, the German military was collapsing and there were fewer high-value targets to engage. But Evelyn performed her duties with the same precision and dedication she had shown from the beginning. By the time Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, she had 18 confirmed hits. 18 enemies who would not threaten American soldiers again because of her skill and courage. The war in Europe was over, but for Evelyn Washington, the struggle was just beginning. She returned to the United States in June of 1945, expecting to be discharged and sent back to civilian life. Instead, she was informed that her service with the OSS was not yet complete. The agency wanted her to remain for debriefing and evaluation, and to participate in training programs for the next generation of operatives. The conflict with Japan was still ongoing, and there was talk of deploying snipers to the Pacific Theater. Evelyn agreed to remain. She was not sure what she would do in civilian life. Her skills were not easily transferable to peacetime employment, and she was not ready to return to typing and filing. The OSS, for all its limitations, was the only place she had ever felt fully capable and fully utilized. She would stay as long as they wanted her. She was at the OSS facility in Virginia on August 6th when the news came that an atomic bomb had been dropped on Hiroshima. 3 days later, a second bomb fell on Nagasaki. On August 15th, Japan announced its surrender, and the conflict was finally fully over. Evelyn heard the news with the other personnel at the facility, gathered around a radio in the common room. There was cheering, embracing, tears of relief and joy. She participated in these celebrations, grateful that the conflict was over, grateful that the dying would stop. But she also felt something else, a hollowness, an uncertainty, a sense that the purpose that had organized her life for the past 3 years had suddenly vanished. What would she do now? Who would she be? The OSS was dissolved in October of 1945, its functions transferred to other agencies. Evelyn was given an honorable discharge, a final handshake from Captain Morrison, and a train ticket back to Chicago. Her service record was classified. Her decorations were noted only in files that would not be opened for decades. As far as the official military history was concerned, she had spent the conflict typing and filing at Fort Des Moines. She returned to her parents' apartment on the south side, to the same 2 rooms where she had grown up, where she had first learned to shoot. Her father was there, older now and frailer, his limp more pronounced than before. Her mother embraced her and wept, and thanked God for bringing her daughter home safely. They did not ask about what she had done during the conflict. They had learned from Samuel's experience that some things could not be spoken about, that some weights had to be carried alone. Evelyn tried to find work. She was 24 years old. With a high school education and 3 years of classified military experience she could not mention. She applied for secretarial positions and was told she was overqualified. She applied for factory jobs and was told the positions had been filled by returning soldiers. She applied at the same insurance company where she had worked before the conflict and was told they had no openings. The country that had used her skills to win the conflict had no place for her now that it was over. She found work eventually, a position as a file clerk at a black-owned law firm that paid less than she had earned before the conflict. She took it because she needed money and because she had no other options. She spent her days organizing documents and typing briefs, using perhaps 1% of her capabilities, trying not to think about what she had been and what she had done. The years passed. Evelyn moved into her own apartment, a small place on 47th Street that she kept as immaculate as her mother had kept their family home. She dated occasionally, but never seriously. She found it difficult to connect with men who did not know her real history. And she could not tell them. She made friends with other women at the law firm, women who knew her as quiet, competent, and private. She told them she had served in the Women's Army Corps during the conflict in administrative support. They had no reason to doubt her. Her father passed in 1952, his heart finally giving out after years of strain from his old wounds. Evelyn was with him at the end, holding his hand, telling him that she was proud of him, that his service had mattered even if the country had not recognized it. He looked at her with eyes that knew everything she had not told him, and he said he was proud of her too. Then he was gone. Her mother passed 5 years later, and Evelyn was alone. She continued her work at the law firm, rising eventually to office manager, a position of modest responsibility and equally modest compensation. She lived quietly, modestly, invisibly, the life that America had prescribed for women like her. But something was changing in the country. The civil rights movement was growing, challenging the segregation and discrimination that had confined Black Americans for generations. In 1954, the Supreme Court declared school segregation unconstitutional. In 1955, Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a Montgomery bus. In 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial and spoke of his dream. Evelyn watched these events with growing hope and growing frustration. Hope because change seemed finally possible, because the structures that had limited her life were beginning to crack. Frustration because she had fought for this country, had risked her life and taken lives in its service, and still she was invisible. Still her contribution was unacknowledged. Still the military that had used her pretended she did not exist. She began to write. Not for publication, not at first, just for herself, to record what she had done and what she had seen. She wrote about her training, her missions, her team. She wrote about the farmhouse at Saint-Colombe and the young gunner's face in her scope. She wrote about the weight she carried and the cost of carrying it. She wrote about what it meant to serve a country that would not claim her service. She wrote for 5 years, filling notebook after notebook with her small, precise handwriting. When she finished, she had more than 500 pages, a complete account of her time with the OSS, from recruitment to discharge. She did not know what to do with it. The story seemed too improbable to be believed, and she had no documentation to support it. Who would take seriously a black woman file clerk who claimed to have been a sniper in the Second World War? The answer came in 1968, when a young historian named Dr. Patricia Hayes contacted her. Hayes was writing a book about African American women who had served in the military during the conflict, and she had come across the old Chicago Defender article about Evelyn Washington. She wanted to know if the story was true. She wanted to interview Evelyn for her book. Evelyn hesitated. She had spent more than 20 years in silence, keeping her history buried, protecting herself from disbelief and dismissal. The idea of speaking openly, of subjecting herself to scrutiny and potential ridicule was frightening. But she also knew that she could not carry this weight alone forever. She needed to share it. She needed the truth to be known. She agreed to the interview. Then she gave Dr. Hayes her notebooks. Hayes was stunned by what she read. Here was not merely an account of military service, but a detailed chronicle of OSS operations in France and Belgium, written by a participant with direct knowledge of missions that remained classified. Here was evidence of a black woman serving in a combat role decades before such service was officially permitted. Here was a story that challenged virtually everything the military had said about race and gender and capability. Hayes was also a careful scholar who knew that extraordinary claims required extraordinary evidence. She could not simply take Evelyn's notebooks at face value. She needed corroboration. She began to research, searching for any documentation that might support or contradict what Evelyn had written. It took her 2 years, but she found it. In the newly opened archives of the OSS, she discovered personnel records confirming Evelyn Washington's service as an operative, her training as a marksman, her deployment to France and Belgium. She found after-action reports from the Saint-Colombe operation that mentioned, though did not name, a sniper who had neutralized the German position. She found Captain Morrison's recommendation for the Bronze Star that had been awarded secretly and buried. And she found Thomas Green. Green had survived the conflict and returned to Ohio, where he worked as an engineer and raised 3 children. He had never forgotten Evelyn Washington or the mission they had conducted together. When Hayes contacted him in 1970, he agreed immediately to be interviewed. He described the Saint-Colomb operation in detail, confirming every element of Evelyn's account. He described her as the finest marksman he had ever seen and one of the bravest soldiers he had served with. He said she deserved to be honored for what she had done and that it was a disgrace that she had been forgotten. Hayes interviewed the other surviving members of the team as well. Margaret Chen, who had become a translator at the State Department. William Kowalski, who had returned to the Chicago police and risen to the rank of captain. They all told the same story. They all remembered Evelyn Washington. Hayes published her book Invisible Warriors, African American Women in the Second World War, in 1972. An entire chapter was devoted to Evelyn Washington, describing her life, her training, her service, and her long years of anonymity. The book included photographs, excerpts from Evelyn's notebooks, and statements from her former teammates. It was the first public documentation of what Evelyn had done. The book received modest attention when it was published, positive reviews in academic journals and the black press, limited coverage elsewhere. But it planted a seed. People now knew that Evelyn Washington existed, that her story was real, that the rumors from 1944 had been true. Over the years that followed, her story spread, cited in other histories, mentioned in documentaries, taught in classrooms. She became gradually a symbol of the hidden contributions that Black Americans had made to the war effort. Evelyn experienced this growing recognition with mixed feelings. She was grateful that the truth was finally known, that she would not die with her service unacknowledged, but she was also uncomfortable with the attention, with being treated as a symbol rather than a person. She had not done what she did for recognition or to make a political statement. She had done it because she had the ability and the opportunity, and because American soldiers were dying. She did not want to be turned into something she was not. She also worried that her story was being simplified, flattened into a feel-good narrative of triumph over adversity. Yes, she had overcome obstacles. Yes, she had proved the doubters wrong, but she had also taken 18 lives. She had looked through her scope at 18 human beings and ended their existence. This was not triumph, this was tragedy, necessary tragedy, justified tragedy, but tragedy nonetheless. She wanted people to understand this. She wanted them to feel the weight. In 1977, Evelyn agreed to speak at a conference on women in the military, her first public appearance since the publication of Hayes's book. She was 66 years old, retired now from the law firm, living on a small pension and Social Security. She walked to the podium with the help of a cane, her frostbitten toes had never fully healed, and looked out at an audience of perhaps 200 people, most of them women, many of them black, all of them waiting to hear her story. She spoke for an hour. She described her childhood on the South Side, her father's teachings, her determination to serve. She described her training, her deployment, her missions. She described the farmhouse at Saint-Colomb, the approach through the corridor, the wait for the gunner to appear, the moment of hesitation when she saw his face. And then she described the shot, the exhale, the trigger pull, the single sharp crack of the rifle, the young man falling backward and out of her sight, the weight that descended on her and had never lifted. She told the audience that she did not regret what she had done. The mission was necessary. The lives she saved were worth the life she took, but she wanted them to understand that there was no glory in it, no satisfaction, no triumph. There was only the terrible necessity of doing what had to be done and carrying the cost. She told them that she hoped they would never have to make the choices she had made. But if they did, if they ever found themselves in a position where they had the capability and the opportunity to save lives through their own skill and courage, she hoped they would not hesitate. She hoped they would do what was necessary, feel the weight and carry on. She received a standing ovation. Afterward, dozens of women approached her, thanking her, embracing her, telling her that her story had inspired them. A young black woman in Army ROTC said that she was joining the military because of Evelyn Washington, that she wanted to prove that women like them could serve at the highest levels. Evelyn took the young woman's hand and told her to serve with honor, to value her own humanity and the humanity of those she faced, and to never forget the weight of what she might be called upon to do. Recognition came slowly, but it came. In 1984, the Army officially acknowledged Evelyn Washington's service, releasing her records and confirming her role in operations in France, Belgium, Germany, and Austria. In 1987, she was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest military decoration for valor, in a ceremony at the Pentagon attended by her surviving teammates and dozens of officials and historians. The citation described her actions at Saint-Colomb and throughout the European campaign, praising her extraordinary heroism and selfless service in combat operations. She was 86 years old. She walked to the podium with her cane, accepted the medal from the Army Chief of Staff, and gave a brief speech thanking her parents, her teammates, and the country that had finally claimed her service. She did not mention the decades of invisibility, the discrimination, the deliberate erasure. She did not need to. Everyone in the room knew. The ceremony was covered by national media, a brief story, perhaps 2 minutes buried in the middle of the broadcast, but it was enough. Evelyn Washington was finally, officially, a hero. She lived 5 more years, passing away peacefully in her apartment on October 15, 1992. She was buried in Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors, a black woman who had served before black people were permitted to serve, a sniper who had operated before women were allowed anywhere near combat. The headstone gave her name, her rank, and her dates of birth and death. Beneath that, a single word: marksman. Thomas Green attended the funeral. He was 86 himself, frail and white-haired, using a wheelchair now. He sat in the front row during the service, listening as speaker after speaker praised Evelyn Washington's courage, her skill, her contribution to the war effort, and to the cause of equality. When the service was over, he remained in his chair, looking at the flag-draped coffin. A reporter approached him and asked what he remembered most about Evelyn Washington. Green was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was steady but soft. He said he remembered waiting at the rally point after the Saint-Colomb mission, not knowing if she would make it back. He remembered the relief when she appeared, moving through the trees with that smooth, silent walk she had. He remembered looking at her face and seeing the weight she was already carrying, the knowledge of what she had done. And he remembered thinking that he had never seen anyone so capable and so human at the same time. He said she was the bravest person he had ever known. Not because she was fearless, she was not, but because she was afraid and did what was necessary anyway, because she felt the cost and paid it anyway, because she carried the weight and never let it crush her. He said that was what courage was, not the absence of fear, the decision to act in spite of it. The reporter thanked him and moved on. Green remained where he was, looking at the coffin, thinking about August of 1944 and a shot that had traveled 300 meters and changed everything, thinking about a young woman from Chicago who had seen what no one else could see and had done what no one else could do. The wind stirred the flags around the graveside. Somewhere in the distance a bugle played taps. Thomas Green closed his eyes and let the memories wash over him. The fear, the chaos, the strange beauty of doing something impossible with people he trusted completely. The morning after Saint-Colomb, when they had learned what Evelyn's shot had accomplished, the embraces, the tears, the overwhelming gratitude, he opened his eyes and looked at the coffin one last time. Then he nodded once, a soldier's farewell, and let his family wheel him away. Evelyn Washington's story did not end with her death. In the years that followed, her example continued to inspire. Historians who documented her service, soldiers who followed in her footsteps, young people who learned that barriers were meant to be broken. In 1994, the first women graduated from Army Sniper School, an achievement that would have been impossible without Evelyn and others like her who had proved what women could do. In 2015, the military opened all combat positions to women, finally acknowledging what Evelyn had demonstrated 70 years earlier. Today, her name is taught in military academies and history classes. Her Distinguished Service Cross is displayed at the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. Alongside her Springfield rifle and the notebooks in which she recorded her service. Visitors stand before these artifacts and read about what she did. The training, the missions, the shot at Saint-Colomb that opened the road and saved the lives. But the artifacts can only tell part of the story. They cannot convey the isolation of waiting alone in a sniper's hide, the intimacy of looking at a target through a scope, the weight of the choice to fire. They cannot convey what it meant to be a black woman in a white man's military, to be dismissed and ignored and erased, to carry on anyway because the work was too important to abandon. They cannot convey the decades of silence, the anonymity, the slow and grudging recognition that came only at the end of a long life. For that, we need the story itself. We need to sit with Evelyn Washington as she teaches herself to shoot in a Chicago alley, as she learns from her father at the kitchen table, as she volunteers for a service that does not want her. We need to follow her through training and deployment, through the hedgerows of Normandy and the forests of the Ardennes. We need to be with her behind that crumbling stone wall, watching the second-floor window, waiting for the gunner to appear. We need to feel her hesitation when she sees his face, that moment of terrible recognition when the target becomes a person. And we need to understand her decision to fire anyway, because the alternative is worse, because the soldiers counting on her cannot be abandoned, because this is what she trained for, and this is who she is. We need to feel the weight, because the weight is the point. The weight is what separates killing from murder, soldiering from butchery. The weight is the cost of taking a life deliberately, knowingly, in full awareness of what you are doing. And the willingness to bear that weight, to feel it completely and carry on anyway, is what makes someone like Evelyn Washington not just a skilled shooter, but a true soldier. She was asked once, in one of her few interviews, if she had any regrets about her service. She thought about it for a long time before answering. She said she regretted the necessity of what she had done. She regretted that young men had been placed behind weapons and turned into targets. She regretted that the world had been organized in such a way that someone had to do what she did. But she did not regret doing it. She did not regret serving her country when her country needed her. She did not regret proving that a black woman could do what she had done. And she did not regret the lives she had saved, the soldiers who went home because she took the shots that let them go home. She said she had carried the weight for nearly 50 years, and she would carry it for whatever time she had left. This was the cost of what she had done, and she would pay it without complaint. Because the alternative, to have the capability and the opportunity and to stand aside, was not something she could have lived with. She said she hoped that people who heard her story would understand this, would understand that service meant sacrifice, that courage meant fear, that heroism meant weight, would understand that the people who protected them, the soldiers and police officers and firefighters, and all the others who put themselves in harm's way, were not superhuman. They were afraid. They were uncertain. They were carrying costs that most people would never see. And they deserved to be honored for that, not as symbols or abstractions, but as human beings who had made human choices and paid human prices. They deserve to be known. Evelyn Washington is known now. Her story has been told, her service has been acknowledged, her name has taken its place in history. But she would not want us to stop with her. She would want us to remember all the others, the black soldiers and women and overlooked people of every description, who served without recognition, who contributed without credit, who carried weights that no one saw. She would want us to find their stories and tell them, to shine light into the shadows of history and reveal what has been hidden, to honor the courage and sacrifice of those who were erased because of who they were. And she would want us to remember the weight, to understand that every soldier who serves, every person who puts themselves in harm's way for others, pays a cost that never fully heals, to respect that cost, to be grateful for those who pay it, to never forget. The legacy of Evelyn Washington lives on in ways both visible and invisible. In the women who serve as snipers in today's military, following a path she cleared, in the historians and educators who teach her story to new generations, in the quiet moments when someone reads about her life and feels inspired to push past their own barriers. But her greatest legacy may be something simpler and more profound. It is the proof, the undeniable, documented, corroborated proof that human beings are capable of more than any category or limitation would suggest. That a girl from the south side of Chicago could become one of the deadliest marksmen in American military history. That a person dismissed and ignored and erased could change the course of a campaign with a single shot. That the barriers we construct are not walls, but choices. And that with enough determination, enough skill, and enough willingness to bear the weight, anyone can choose to break them down. In the summer of 2018, a group of ROTC cadets visited the National Museum of African American History and Culture and stood before the display case containing Evelyn Washington's Distinguished Service Cross. Their instructor, a young captain who had written her thesis on women in military history, told them about the farmhouse at Saint-Colomb, the fortified position, the corridor of no return, the single shot that opened the road. She told them about the weight, about what it meant to take a life deliberately from a distance, with time to think about what you were doing. She told them that Evelyn Washington had felt that weight and carried it for 50 years, and that she had done so because the alternative, to stand aside when she had the ability to act, was not something she could live with. The cadets listened in silence. Some of them would go on to serve in combat. Some of them would face choices similar to the one Evelyn had faced behind that stone wall. They did not know this yet, could not know what lay ahead, but they knew now that it was possible, that someone had done it before them, had felt what they might feel, had chosen what they might choose. That was the gift Evelyn Washington had given them. Not a formula, not a guarantee, just the knowledge that the path existed, that it could be walked, that the weight could be borne. The instructor finished her presentation and gave the cadets time to reflect. One young woman, a sophomore from Detroit, lingered at the display case after the others had moved on. She studied the medal, the rifle, the faded notebooks behind the glass. She thought about Evelyn Washington at her age, practicing in alleys, dreaming of something more. She made a silent promise to herself that day, to serve with honor, to push past every barrier, to carry whatever weight was asked of her, to never forget. Outside the museum, the sun was setting over Washington, D.C., painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. The cadets gathered on the steps, talking quietly about what they had seen. In a few years, they would scatter across the world, to bases and deployments and missions they could not yet imagine. They would face challenges and make choices and pay costs. But they would not face them alone. They would carry with them the example of those who had gone before, the pioneers, the barrier breakers, the quiet heroes who had proved what was possible. They would carry Evelyn Washington with them. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.